know if this is gonna work. He's a Canadian wrestler, and they're billing him as from Scotland and with the kilt, and I don't know if it's gonna work. And man, I mean, how can anybody ever say it didn't work? I mean, it was money. Voted the best villain in wrestling history. Roddy Piper was just that damn good. And if anybody heard Ric Flair's Hall of Fame introduction speech of Roddy Piper, he was just as big of a partier as Ric Flair was. But one thing he said about Piper is, like, Piper never had any fear. He was fearless. It didn't matter what the situation was. He always felt that he can do it. He can. There could be a 7 foot, 400-pound guy in front of him, and he needed to get by him to get into the other room, and everybody else would walk away, and Piper would be right there in the guy's face, and it's unbelievable. I mean, he was so heavily involved in the history of this industry. WrestleMania 1 with Bob Orton, who happens to be our guest at Legends of the Ring this October. I'm sure we'll have a lot of stories and conversations to talk about with Cowboy Bob Orton regarding Roddy Piper. WrestleMania 1, he tagged up with Orton. They took on Mr. T and Hulk Hogan, and that was the first ever WrestleMania. And then WrestleMania 2, we had the boxing match with Mr. T that led to, of course, him body slamming Mr. T and getting disqualified and all hell breaking loose. And in WrestleMania 10, he was a special guest referee. I mean, he was so heavily involved in this business, and his rage, his spontaneous outbursts, and his very quick-witted humor and sarcasm. It was very fitting that Ric Flair hailed Piper as the most gifted entertainer in the history of professional wrestling, and I have to agree. And now you look back and say, everybody always says, who do you think's the best with the microphone? And people say CM Punk and even Macho Man Randy Savage, Ric Flair, and people always forgot about Rowdy Piper and the Piper's Pit and things that he used to do, and the way he used to rub he was so involved in so many storylines, from the coconut with Snuka to adorable Adrian Adonis and wrecking the flower shop, and of course, who can forget everything that led up to WrestleMania 3 when on Piper's Pit was the whole when Andre the Giant sided with Bobby Heenan and turned on Hogan and ripped the shirt and the cross off and demanded a championship match at WrestleMania 3 against the Hulkster. So, I mean, he was so heavily involved in the feuds with Greg Valentine and Adrian Adonis and Hogan and Mr. T and, the things that went back with him and Captain Lou Albano and Cyndi Lauper and the whole rock and wrestling era. I mean, it was just, he helped revolutionize the business. Everybody talks about Hogan, but I feel without Piper, there might not have been a Hogan. Who knows if Hulk Hogan's legacy would have been as big as it was the first 10 years he was in WWE when it was WWF, not prior, if Roddy Piper wasn't so heavily involved in feuds with him, or at least stirring up feuds with wrestlers involving Hogan. The Piper's Pit was something that was fresh and new, and that stirred up, every time there was a show, that stirred up controversy, that stirred up storylines and pay-per-view main events, back then when there was only 4 of them. So it was great, and so many shows spinned off from that, if you think about it. Of course, Jesse the Body had the body shop, you had the flower shop, you had the barber shop, you had the snake pit, you had the funeral parlor, you had the Brother Love show. I mean, there was so many spin-offs of that, but it was all basically Roddy Piper. If Piper wasn't so successful with that little promo sideshow, then none of those other ones probably would have happened. The one Y2J and Edge, and all these little sideshows that they had, and even the Rock show. All these little sideshows never would have happened. I personally don't think, unless Roddy Piper was so successful with Piper's Pit. So, inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2005. Was named top villain in wrestling history by WWE.com and its fans. He was an actor as well, and admittedly so. He always said he was not a good actor. He was in that movie They Live, which was a really bad movie. He had a recurring role in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. So just a Canadian boy who just happened to be slapped with a gimmick, and it worked. And he started off with this tiny little skinny kid, 15 years old, made his debut in Winnipeg, and lost a match in 10 seconds to Larry Hennig, which everybody knows is Kurt Hennig, aka Mr. Perfect's father, Curtis Axel's grandfather. 10 seconds, the all-time record in the Winnipeg arena. He lost a match, and he said himself it wasn't a matter of, he lost in 10 seconds, but it was after the match where he was treated as one of the guys now. He was given that respect. He earned his stripes. Everybody knew how hard he worked to get where he was, and just to get into the ring and lose to an icon like Larry Hennig. So he kind of earned the respect. He moved on to do other things. He was in the AWA for a while, NWO Houston, and he wrestled in Dallas for the Von Erichs. So he moved on, and then his big move was in 1975, and he got into the NWA, and that's kind of where it all started. He wrestled with some of the greats like Chavo Guerrero Sr. and of course, eventually Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes and Harley Race, Rick Martel. It just the names go on and on and on, and he just slowly progressed through the wrestling ranks. From 75 to 80, he was all about the NWA, and then he moved on to Georgia Championship Wrestling in 1980, where again he continued to feud with Ric Flair. He also wrestled Don Morocco and Sergeant Slaughter, Greg Valentine, and he defeated Ric Flair for the U.S. belt, and it made that super feud. Back then with kayfabe, nobody knew that Ric Flair and Piper were chilling out and after matches and traveling together and having a great all time. And as you'll hear later on in our Hall of Fame induction speech, but he made a name for himself. He didn't rest on his laurels. He didn't say, all right, I had a great match with Ric Flair, and that's all I need to do. People are going to notice me. No, he just kept it going, and eventually he made his way to the WWF at the time, full-time in 1984 under Vince McMahon Sr. at the time. And he was actually a face when he first got there, because one of the storylines was he had the bagpipes, and Freddie Blassie stuffed his bagpipes with toilet paper so he couldn't play in front of the Madison Square Garden crowd. So that whole thing started. But from 84 to 87, Vince McMahon Jr., who started pretty much taking over things at that point, wanted him to become this ultimate villain, and he teamed them up with guys like Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff and Bob Orton, and they took on guys like Bruno Sammartino and eventually Hulk Hogan and Mr. T. We mentioned the feud with Jimmy Snuka, Greg Valentine, Adrian Adonis, on and on and on, and it just eventually made its way up into the WrestleManias, and then the rest is pretty much history. I mean, you had WrestleMania 3, which was supposed to be his retirement match against Brutus the Barber Beefcake. Of course, we know that didn't happen. He disappeared for a little while, but never out of the eye. People, this is starting to get into the cable era, so people had their eyes on him, and he would make appearances here and there. 1989 through 92, he returned, and he did a Piper's Pit at WrestleMania 10, and everybody remembers the Morton Downey Jr. fire extinguisher incident when he was smoking in the ring, and he started the feud with Heenan and Rick Rude and Brother Love, and again, without Piper's Pit successfulness, Brother Love probably wouldn't even have had his gimmick that he had, and then he had the Bad News Brown, the very racially insensitive feud with Bad News Brown, where he painted himself half black, and and that happened at WrestleMania 6. So I mean, there was some stuff that went on that was a little crazy. He's the one that supported Virgil to break away from the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. Taught him how to fight, and things like that. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. And he was one of the guys who went to WCW when everybody was jumping ship in '96, and he appeared at Halloween Havoc, went right after Hogan immediately, so he picked up right where he left off. And then in a weird twist, he joined forces with Ric Flair and the Horsemen, and so it was a great career. Even when he came back to WWE in 2003, as an older guy, already in his 50s, and had a couple gimmick matches, and made some appearances in TNA when Vince Russo and Hogan were there, and came back again to WWE in 2005, and again had a couple gimmick matches, and he took part in an interview with Stone Cold Steve Austin and Shawn Michaels, which I remembers him super kicking Piper in the face, and on. I mean, the whole Hall of Fame thing was great, and the whole as these guys get older and they start appearing at conventions and signings and independent wrestling circuits, and it's fun to see them. There was a couple of them where Piper and Snuka was signing autographs together, and they're signing the poster of the whole Coconut Piper's Pit incident, and people are gonna say it was a little insensitive, but back then there was really no cable, there was no internet. This stuff didn't get around in 5 seconds. We had to read, PWI or The Wrestler, and every month to get updates. Or if you were a WWF magazine subscriber, you got one every 2 months. And you had basically the news was old. So it was kind of it was kind of old. So it was kind of hard to see any of that stuff. But he did the independent circuits like everybody else did. I mean, from 2005 to just recently last year, and some this year he did some JCWs, and he did a bunch of shows, and just his legacy. I mean, he's considered one of the greatest talkers and heels in the history of wrestling. The Piper's Pit interview segments were, top notch. He changed the industry when it came to things like that. I don't even know what more to say. I mean, the interviews were great. Many people in Piper's Pit, who made their way on there, got more publicity, and eventually, some of them, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them, went on to become world champions. So they got that attention. According to Bobby Heenan, he could just leave Piper in a room and return 20 minutes later, and Piper would have already done a Class A promo all by himself. He's one of the greatest. Ronda Rousey adapted her nickname Rowdy, and actually called and got his permission, and they became really, really good friends. And as you heard earlier in the show, when we played our opening monologue, Ronda Rousey actually gave a shout out to the late Rowdy Roddy Piper right after her victory last night.